Good morning. So glad to see you today. This is the day that the Lord has made. And I can't think of any better way to rejoice and be glad in it than to gather as we are this morning in His presence, worship Him with our voices and our hearts, and listen to how His Word changes our lives. I pray that we'll do that today. I'm glad that you're here this morning. So there's this new TV game show called Awake. Has anybody heard of that before? Maybe a couple of you may have watched an episode or two before. I have watched an episode or two, and I got to tell you, it's no Jeopardy, so don't get your hopes up. But it is kind of entertaining. If I had to describe it, it's kind of like a mixture between Deal or No Deal and every high school youth group retreat you've ever been on. So they get like 7 or so contestants up on this stage together, and what they do is they make them go through these games and challenges individually, not seeing one another, and then they bring them all back together, and then they have to determine whether or not they think they excelled more in those challenges than their opponents. That's the basic idea of the game. But there's just one catch. Every contestant in this show must stay awake for 24 consecutive hours prior to participating in the show. And they don't just have to stay awake. What they do is they take and they put them in this locked room together, and in the middle of the room is $1 million in quarters. And they spend the next 24 hours counting quarters for 24 consecutive hours. And however many quarters they can accurately count, that's how much money they're competing to win in these challenges. All that to say, when the show begins, there are these 7 people standing up on a stage. And by the look of them, they look like 7 ordinary people. They look and they talk and they act and they appear just like anybody else. You would not guess, in other words, that they had just spent the last 24 hours counting out like $50,000 in quarters. They look just like everybody else. But then you start to do these games and challenges, and you can see very quickly that things were not as they appeared. These folks, in fact, are very different than they were 24 hours ago. So they make them do these like balancing challenges. And if you look closely, you can see a lot of them, their hands are kind of shaking. Because when you've been without sleep for a really long time, your hands kind of start shaking. And they'll make them do these things where they have to remember things and recall them later. And it's amazing just how much their recollection is slowed. Coordination challenges, same thing. Depth perception, hand-eye coordination. All of this is just totally out of whack. And it doesn't take long to realize, if you're watching the show, that these people who first looked and acted and seemed so very ordinary, beneath the surface, they're just plain tired. Like hard to keep your eyes open, tired. Like maybe just got back from wilderness trek, tired. They just really want to go to bed. And that's the one interesting thing about the show. What happens when you take away this basic, essential human need? What you find is that they can sleepwalk and go through the motions and appear just fine, just like everybody else. But they're not the same. Things are not as they appear from the outside looking in. And today, as we return to Revelation chapter 3, if you want to be turning there, as we return to our series and the 5th of the 7 letters that we find in these chapters, 7 letters to 7 churches, today we're going to meet the church that is not as it seems. Today we're going to meet the church that can sleepwalk and go through the motions and appear just fine. But they are not as they seem. If you haven't already, go ahead and turn to Revelation chapter 3. This is where we find the letter to a church in Sardis. The Sardians, as they were called. I personally was disappointed that they're not called the Sardines, but nevertheless, they're called the Sardians. We may as well, for our purposes, call them the sleepwalking church, or even more than that, the walking dead, because that's what Christ will call them. And this chapter really challenges me as much, if not more, than all the other 7 letters. Because the lesson we learn from this chapter is that my life with Christ is not just about the way it appears from the outside looking in. And this letter calls us, sleepwalk no more. It's time to wake up. So let's dive into this letter. Hans read it a moment ago for us, but I feel it's best that we just read through it once more yet again. Revelation chapter 3 and verse 1, to the angel of the church in Sardis write, the words of him who has the 7 spirits of God and the 7 stars. I know your works. You have the reputation or the name of being alive, but you are dead. Wake up and strengthen what remains and is about to die, for I have not found your works complete in the sight of my God. Remember then what you have received and heard. Keep it and repent. If you will not wake up, I will come like a thief, and you will not know at what hour I will come against you. Yet you have still a few names in Sardis, people who have not soiled their garments, and they will walk with me in white, for they are worthy. The one who conquers will be clothed thus in white garments, and I will never blot his name out of the book of life. I will confess their name before my Father and before his angels. The one who has an ear, let them hear what the Spirit says to the churches. Now, what is this letter saying to us this morning? Because for me, right away, I actually noticed 1 or 2 things that I find kind of interesting. And if you've been following along in our series, maybe you might have noticed some of these things too. First of all, I noticed that unlike Pergamum and unlike Thyatira and unlike Sardis and Ephesus, all of those churches that the letters have been given to so far, unlike all of those, did you notice that there's not even a hint of persecution mentioned in this letter? Did you notice that? And while we're at it, unlike Pergamum and Thyatira and Smyrna and Ephesus, all those churches we've seen so far, did you notice that not once does it mention idolatry or any sort of false teacher or teaching like we've seen in so many of these letters? No, put away your idols. In Thyatira, they had that person called Jezebel who was leading them astray. None of that. In Ephesus and in Pergamum, they talked about the Nicolaitans and their false ways. Didn't hear any of that here. None of those things that we've seen at nearly every stop along the road. So when I look here at Sardis and I see a church that doesn't have persecution that we know of like so many others, and it doesn't seem to be dealing with the idolatry and false teaching that we know of like so many others, I tend to think things are going pretty well for this church here in Sardis, right? This is a church that has the appearance of being a flourishing church with its ducks in a row, and things are going right. That's how it appears to me. So why is it that here, out of all the letters we've read, why is it that here and here alone does Christ skip right over the praise and encouragement and affirmation that he always leads with in his letters and go straight to, you look like you're alive, but you're not. Actually, you're dead. That's how his teaching begins to them. He said, you have the reputation of being alive, but you're dead. Now, as I recall, in every letter we've studied so far, there's been this obvious pattern. It starts with, to the angel in such and such city, the church there. And after that, it talks about this little description of Jesus and all of his glory. Every letter has this, by the way. And then after that, every single time we have gone next to this word of affirmation. Usually it begins, I know your works. And then Christ goes on to encourage and build up the church. No matter how far they may have gone off the rails, no matter how many difficult things are going on in their church, he always reaches first for these words that build them up in every single case. Then, as it's needed, he may bring his criticism and warning, but only after building them up. It's how it's been every time until now, until Sardis, the city with no sign of persecution, nothing that we know of as far as idolatry and false teaching. Yet to Sardis, he skips right over the good things. He will say them later. In Sardis, his first words are this knock you off your feet, staggering blow. You look like you're alive, but guess what? Whoa. Surprising. Why? Why here in Sardis? Why not in all of the other cities who clearly had problems of their own? Why here? I think the answer is in the two words that follow this verse. Because Sardis, I think, is given this startling first sentence in their teaching because they might need something that their fellow churches may not need quite as much as them. They need a wake-up call. And so this letter says, wake up. The first words of verse 2 are, in fact, wake up and strengthen what remains and is about to die, for I have not found your works complete in the sight of my God. You see, when I look at this church in Sardis, what I think they need more than anything else is to learn that the Christian faith is not a matter of appearance, as if going through the motions were all that was necessary. The faith that Christ seeks, constantly seeks, to strengthen its weaknesses, to strive toward perfection, to press on toward completion, like Paul, who says that he's pressing on toward a goal. It's not hinging on how we appear to be, but instead it hinges upon our hearts. In some ways, I think the lesson this church is learning is not very different from the lesson of King David when God calls King David to be his people's king. That story's in 1 Samuel chapter 16. And in that story, you may recall, God has many people brought before him, appear before him to be potentially made king. Lots of capable folks. They look strong. They look like they would fit. But he doesn't choose any of them. Why? Because God sees not as man sees. He's not looking or judging by appearance or by the height of somebody, those external things that might seem important maybe to us. Instead, human beings may look toward outward appearance, but the Lord looks at the heart. And so it is with Sardis. And so it is with God's church. Yes, these Christians in Sardis may seem to be quite vibrant and put together well by the appearance of things. They have a lot going for them. But God does not see like we see. And the reputation of being alive is not the same as the heart that is alive. Alive and yearning for completion. Striving for perfection. Sleepwalking through the motions will not do, this letter says. Christ is calling his church to wake up. And I wonder, is he calling us still? Is he calling his church to awaken? Because it seems to me that the church in Sardis, though they do not have some of those familiar enemies, idolatry, persecution, and false teachings, or at least that's how it appears, they do still face some formidable opponents, don't they? Opponents like complacency, keeping up appearances, a religion that is ritual without heart, a satisfaction with the way things are instead of the way things ought to be. And what I can say for my own life of faith is that those are some pretty formidable opponents, some pretty strong forces that work against us. And I'm really challenged by this passage. Because for me, and maybe in some ways, standing up here plays a part in this, but it can be easy to have the reputation of being alive, to use the words of this letter. It can be easy to give the look of a vibrant faith. But I have to ask myself, is it so in my heart? And I have to keep on asking myself that question. And only a deeper look into myself can reveal the answer. And maybe it's the same way for all of us. Maybe this challenge exists for us all, the challenge of not just seeming to have faith on any given Sunday, but really looking into our hearts, into our lives, and asking ourselves, are we awake? Are we awake or sleepwalking through the motions? The lesson of the church in Sardis says, wake up. Sleepwalk no longer. And it's a very important lesson. Verse 3 says, if you will not wake up, I will come like a thief, and you will not know at what hour I will come against you. You know, Colby and I were talking in the office this week about how important this teaching must really be, that the day of the Lord will come like a thief. You know, we actually find some version of this teaching in the writings of Matthew, of Luke, of Paul, of Peter, and of John. And of course, they go back to Jesus' own words. So 5 of these writers in our New Testament who, through God's Spirit, by their pen, write about 85% of the New Testament, they are all saying this very same thing. The day will come like a thief. And what does that mean? Well, it's not sinister like it sounds, like God is a thief. We tend to think of that as a bad thing. I don't think the point is to be sinister. The point is to remind us that Christ's coming, and even our own lives, are not really ours to control, are they? Christ's coming and our lives are not based on our timetable, based on God's timing. And so the message, wake up, be alert, strengthen what remains, paired with this reminder is, wake up now. Wake up today. Because we are not in control of our lives. And yet we have been given this day. This day to be awake and alive for Christ's coming. So how do we do that? How do we live as those who are awake and alive and who are not just sleepwalking through the motions? Well, I think that this passage gives us a few words of guidance, some direction on how to do that. And the way that I'd like to share these last things with you is to put them like questions that maybe you could ask yourself if you really want to take that deeper look into yourself and ask yourself, am I awake? So, one question. this passage will ask us is, well, one way to know if you're awake, are you doing what you're hearing? Are you practicing what God's word is preaching to us? Or is it like so many things that I hear throughout the day, it kind of goes in one ear and out the other? This passage says, wake up and strengthen what remains. And one way to do that is to remember what you have received and heard, but don't just put it up in the memory banks or just collect it all like knowledge for later. Remember those things you've heard and keep them, which is another way of saying obey them. Put these words into practice in your life. Because in the action of doing what we hear, of practicing what we have heard and received, that's when we move from complacency to strength. It's how we grow. Because as we work on our faith and we practice what God has said to us, it's not just we alone who are working. God works in us too. You know, one of my favorite examples of this is in Philippians chapter 2, where Paul urges the church in Philippi. He tells them that in the same way that you have always obeyed, don't stop now. Like, don't grow complacent now. Like, don't start sleepwalking now. In the same way that you've always obeyed, keep doing it. Now, continue to work out your salvation with fear and trembling, which is to say, with reverence for the awesomeness of God and in obedience, putting into practice what He's given us to do in view of His coming. And as we put these things in practice, we do not work alone, for it is God who works in you, both to His will and to work for His good pleasure. So as we put these things to practice in our lives, God is working in us as well, transforming us, shaping us to be spiritually awake and alive. So that's question number one, to ask ourselves, are we doing what we're hearing? And the second one from this passage, are you following the faithful? Are we following looking to and learning from the faithful examples of those in our real lives who are not just going through the motions, but who set an example for us of how to be awake and how to be alive? Here in this church and in Sardis, there are people like that. So Christ says in verse 4 that you still have among you in Sardis a few who are dressed in white clothing, which is a symbolic way of saying that they are striving with their lives to be pure and faithful followers of Christ in a world of sin. And these faithful ones set an example for us, because if we will do what they have done, you too will be clothed thus in white garments. In your name, Christ will not blot from the book of life. These are the kinds of promises that we are given if we will seek Christ with pure and yearning hearts. Christ is able, by the power of His blood, to wash us clean. No matter how stained with sin our lives may have become, He can wash us clean and make our garments white, because when we are baptized in His name, we are raised and clothed with Christ, clothed in white, cleansed from our sin. And here in this place, we have many faithful people like those who were in Sardis, who truly do desire to live those faithful, obedient lives. And we're blessed if we'll look to them, learn from them, follow them. Are you doing what you're hearing? Are you following those faithful examples? Because there really is no time like the present to answer the question of this letter. Will you wake up and obey? No time like the present to look into our hearts and ask ourselves, am I going through the motions? Or am I working out my salvation before my God for His goodwill and His good pleasure? It really is a question only you can answer for you. But I'd encourage you to ask yourself that question this morning. And maybe as you look deeply into yourself and ask that question, there may be things that need to change in your life, things to repent of, whether in your own life or perhaps with the help of this church. We all have things like that. I pray that God will work on our hearts, all of our hearts, to do that. Maybe someone, as you reflect on this question, you are ready to be clothed with Christ in baptism, washed clean, in garments white, just as we're given this promise here. Raised up, awake and alive for His coming. However you may be challenged by this message, we give this moment to reflect and respond while we stand and while we sing.